got this new little setup that will broadcast things to multiple locations. All right. That's what I'm talking about. I succeeded. Excellent. All righty. So now I'm going to hit record. All right. There we go. Boom. All right. Hello, everybody. This is Trip, and it is time for TheoCon, Theology in a Time of Crisis. And today we are talking about, guess what? Religion and science. You knew that, didn't you? That's why you came here. And we're going to be joined by three different people, three different scholars who I'm friends with, all of them in different ways. And Sarah and I are pretty excited about this. And I'm going to do short introductions so we can get into the content and the conversation. But if you use the Google machine, it will tell you tons of things about all of them. And you can always go purchase their books and read and engage more. One of our keynoters is Norman Wirzba, and he is at Duke University, where he teaches theology, has been working in all sorts of ecological, ethical, and theological ways. And one of the coolest things about Norman is when I first moved back to North Carolina, I emailed him out of the blue, and he didn't just say he wanted to do an interview. He said he wanted to hang out with me. And then he shared with me about his life and his work. And then when I walk out, I met a couple students, and they're like, Norman is simultaneously our smartest professor and the most actually Christian and kind and compassionate one. And that means he can be a theologian and a good human at the same time. Wow. What's up with that? That's awesome. And I said nice things about someone at Duke, which doesn't happen very often, as someone that went to Wake Forest University. Go Deeks. And then we have Philip Clayton, who is my dissertation supervisor. So I could tell you stories that would make you love him and other stories, but the good ones way outweigh the bad ones. He is a brilliant philosopher, participates in the religion science dialogue, and a very creative theologian. And underneath that, an awesome friend. And so, maybe we have two theologians who've been whose students actually dig them, and that's going to be pretty fun. And if you've seen their keynotes, you already know that they brought high quality material. And responding to their keynotes, and a part of the postdoc collective that I'm a part of here at the University of Edinburgh. Bethany's a part of it at Oxford, and she's going to be responding. And then you'll see that I'm biased, but she's my favorite of all the postdocs. And not just because we got lost in San Diego, ended up at an Italian restaurant, told each other our whole life stories, and realized that she's smart and fun, and didn't get completely freaked out when I was overly confident we were lost in the middle of nowhere. So those are three excellent human beings, and they're right here for your science and religion pleasuring of the brain. And first up, to give you a summary and invitation for those that have not engaged their talk, is Norman. Take it away.
Sure. So my presentation was, in essence, about the question of how we redesign and engineer our world. We've been doing this for a very, very long time. As long as human beings have tried to secure food, make energy, do any of the things that we need to do to survive, we've been modifying the planet. We're now in the Anthropocene age, which is an age in which that power has become so ginormous that we have now become major geomorphological forces, meteorological forces, genetic forces. We have the power now to radically alter most places on this planet, and we're certainly doing it at a very rapid pace. And my question in the talk is, how is it that theologians seem not to have spent a lot of time trying to understand what their role is in presenting a theological vision for the making of our places, and what would that theological vision look like? And what I suggest is that part of our confusion around this and part of our lack of engagement stems from a pretty defunct doctrine of creation, but also from some pretty deeply held misunderstandings about the kind of place we believe the world to be. And so I describe a version of place in which it's not so much a location, but a set of paths that are coming together, that are generating the life that flows through these kinds of co-becoming. And then also a doctrine of creation, which is not fundamentally about how the world began, however long ago, but a doctrine of creation, which is fundamentally about participating in God's creative ways that promote fertility, fecundity, flourishing. So that's what this talk was about.
And Philip, thank you.
Thanks. It's great to be with such an amazing group of people to talk about such an important set of issues. This series occurs in the midst of a pandemic, which in my state is now completely exploding out of all control. That led then to protests in the streets against the racism in the United States, protests of a sustained nature that had not occurred since before the civil rights era. There's a pervasive sense of crisis, of stress, of the normal collapsing around us. What kind of response can academics make? And in particular for today, what kinds of responses can people in religion science make? Well, traditionally, religion science is thought to be a sort of value-free discussion of various religions and their relationships to various scientific facts. But I suggest that it's time to completely change that paradigm, to do religion science discussion in a new key altogether. I think it's time to take not science as the settled conclusions of physics or theoretical biology, but to take a transformative science like the ecological sciences, or ecology in particular, and to think of religion not an abstract study of value-free understanding of different religious traditions and practices, but to take it in the way that theology has traditionally been, which is to speak prophetically to the situation in which people find themselves. And that's as true as in Christianity, by the way, as it is in Buddhism. So what I advocate in the lecture and want to advocate in this discussion is that we seek to understand ecological systems as endangered and their collapse as endangering not only our species, but countless other species on this planet. That we reboot science and religion as an engaged discipline that calls people's attention to the nature of our existence in the world, to using scientific facts as a way of providing a framework for theological or religious reflection, and of gearing religious actions in the world in ways that call forth the fundamental values that are raised by collapsing ecosystems and call to a transformation of action in the world.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, both of you. I appreciated both of your talks immensely. And what was fascinating to me were two things, actually. Two things I think really tied both of these talks together. And I'm hoping that we can discuss in more detail. The first thing that I noticed that you both shared in common was an emphasis in your talks on transformation. Both of you are advocating not moving beyond theology or leaving religions behind us, but actually exploring the richly textured theologies and religious traditions that are available to us in a way that we haven't done before, and using theology as a motivation and a means for personal, communal, ecological, and global transformation. And you did this in slightly different ways, which is always great. So for Norman, there was an emphasis on placemaking, an emphasis on taking placemaking seriously, cultivating the art of placemaking, not as a location, but as something much more complex than that. Cultivating the art of participating in and with God in the healing, transformation of places and persons as being located inherently within those places. Norman emphasized how neither persons nor places are discrete, easily circumscribable, solitary entities, but are changeable, permeable sites through which a dynamic, temporally extended, diverse constellation of paths develop and subside. It's such a beautiful way of phrasing it. We are stitched into life with all other creatures, Norman emphasizes. There's no you apart from a place or apart from all the other yous out there. Places and persons can be thought of as verbs, not just as nouns. And then similarly to that, creation takes on a completely different hue. Creation in this vision is not a story about how things began, but is a moral and spiritual topography that invites us to orient ourselves, our lives and our ways in such a way that we witness to and extend God's ways of being in the world. And this can affect all sorts of very concrete, practical things, everything from eating habits and agricultural practices to engineering and design, asking whether our spaces and places and buildings reflect God's hospitable modalities. Norman asks us, what could this place become if the love of God is its orienting and animating power? It's such a compelling vision. There's an emphasis here on a spirituality of transformation rather than a spirituality of escape. And I think this is a key for both Philip and Norman, a spirituality of transformation rather than a spirituality of escape. And Philip similarly challenges us to move beyond value-free theology in this outworking, this pursuit of transformation. In particular, he emphasizes the shortfalls really in the science and religion field. Most of us on this call are involved in the science and religion field in one way or another. And so I think we all probably feel quite comfortable critiquing it as participants in it. And this is a field that has liked to see itself as value-free, or at least as working in and with disciplines that prioritize being militantly objective whenever possible, in such a way that our science and religion disciplinary results become predictably and almost necessarily abstract, divorced from everything that might be seen as soft or unscientific, things like values, meaning, purpose. But Philip reminds us that religions are not morally or ethically neutral. They're not. They are inherently value-laden in all their specificity. Religions need to move into the space of their own resources and beliefs, practices, ethics. We need to challenge the historical, systematic, and analytic reduction of those religions, and the reduction of theology. There's more there. There's more potential, more of a call, more responsibility for theology, for science and religion. And so Philip calls for a rebooting of science and religion, a rebooting that moves beyond the sorts of abstract obsessions of the past years and expansively invites explorations and actions that stem from engagement, not only with Christian theology, but with non-Western religious traditions as well, plumbing the depths of the particular religious traditions that are manifest throughout the world. This is a science and religion that's fundamentally about transformation, about values, about an orientation toward liberation. So this emphasis on transformation is, I think, key to both of our talks this evening. And then one thing in closing that I would mention is that what's fascinating to me about both these talks is that neither of them engaged in specificity or detail the current crises that we are calling COVID-19, or even systemic racism, all the other kind of things that are in the news at the moment, which is fascinating. It's a fascinating approach to this. We're talking about theology in a time of crisis, but there's a way in which both Philip and Norman are zooming out and asking us to think bigger, more expansively about the ecologies and systems of which COVID-19 and systemic racism and all these other particular crises are a part, right? We are embedded in these ecologies and systems. And when they are not tended to or transformed or cared for in a divinely oriented manner, can produce the many crises that we now see around us. These crises, in fact, are not divorced from one another. There's a link between poor treatment of others and poor treatment of the earth. Domination of people groups and domination of the earth go hand in hand. So we shouldn't be exploring either any particular crisis in the world in isolation from this larger crisis, this larger ecological, whole Earth global crisis in which we find ourselves. In the face of this linkage between the oppression of the earth and the oppression of peoples, we must urgently consider and engage what Philip reminds us Catherine Keller has called attentive practices of thought, love, rage, importantly, and care. So thank you both for those extremely helpful talks. And now I am going to turn things over to Bethany, who will offer a response to both Norman and Philip.
Well, thank you. I'm really grateful to Sarah and Tripp for the chance to respond to such an important and fascinating set of contributions. Philip spoke of the need to sort of reboot science and religion in order for it to address the increasingly urgent needs of the earth and her populations. And in your talk, Philip, you wondered why eco-theological resources have been drastically underread and underused, and why science and religion as a discipline has been slow to address these issues that clearly sit at the complex intersection of the questions it normally addresses. And I sort of thought of two possible reasons. First, people are pain avoidant, and ecology is a painful and frightening subject. So as Aldo Leopold said, one of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. The reality is we've been in crisis for a really long time now, and most of us have never noticed. So not only does studying ecology open you up to being wounded in landscapes that were once beautiful and restful. I remember wandering a forest path with an ecologist and saying, "Oh, that's a beautiful flower. What is it?" "Invasive species," came the grim reply. You know, it was not a beautiful flower. But studying ecology eventually requires you to change your lifestyle in uncomfortable and sometimes unwelcome ways. You can study the philosophical implications of fine-tuning all your life and never have to think about the cost of flying across the world to conferences or turning your heat on all the time or eating meat or any of the other things. So at the intersection of theology and ecology, there's no way to avoid the ethical implications of what we're studying. And I think a lot of us would rather just not bother. A second, more sort of mundane reason might simply be that many of the philanthropic organizations that fund much of the research in science and religion are not interested in eco-theology. So in particular, the Templeton Foundations, which I used to work with and still work closely with, have shied away from funding theological research in eco-theology. Part of this is because Sir John Templeton was not interested in it, but also partly because it has not been seen as a producer of new spiritual information. It hasn't been seen as a really viable and thriving place of theological and spiritual practice. But I think given your talk on the fertile grounds that this area provides for thinking through the practical riches of numerous faith traditions, perhaps we could show potential philanthropists, sort of Templeton and beyond, how vital this research is and how important it is that it should be taken to a central place in what is considered the core of the science and religion curriculum. So both changing things on that side, but also changing our curriculums to include this area. Now, one question I had coming out of your lecture, Philip, was from a slide at the beginning that shows the exponential rate of increase in global population. So when I talk to optimistic ecologists, the answer is generally the same. They sort of say, well, it's not the carrying capacity of the world that's incapable of supporting our population, but that it's incapable of doing so with the lifestyle we lead. And so then they talk about the ways to cut back the impact of how we live. But even if that's true for another half century or century, and even if we could reduce our exploitative use of the planet, at some point we'll need to talk about what needs to be done when we do reach the carrying capacity, if we're not already at it. So I want to ask, how would you address that both theologically and practically? What do we do when we have multiplied and filled the earth? How does society, whose economic models are based on ongoing growth, need to be restructured if we look at a voluntary limiting or even reduction of Earth's human population? And what does theology really have to say about that? Norman, your sweeping introduction to placemaking reminded me of visits I made out to Galiano Island off the coast of Vancouver to visit the eco-theologians Lauren and Mary Ruth Wilkinson. Now, as every visitor to his place will know, the introduction into island life begins with realizing that there is no away. Where does garbage go, you asked? The answer is, of course, it goes away. But on an island, there is no away. And increasingly on the planet of Earth, there is no away. And that central sense that we really need to confront our lifestyles came through so strongly. And I found the concept of replacing a theology of escape with a theology of transformation really generative, as is the close connection between placemaking and self-making. And Sarah, you picked up on this as well in your response. And both of these thoughts made me start thinking about the history of monastic traditions, communal living, which reduced the impact of living on the lands and societies around, communities that saw the transformation of the self as an essential part of flourishing, and with some of the time at least, vows of stability that voluntarily took away the escape clause. And so I began to wonder about the revitalization of this sort of new monasticism movement and whether it might hold a hopeful expression of a new way to live. So Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove's work is in my mind here, and others. And the basics are to make communal living a normal option of a way to live. So at the moment, we tend to think of living in shared accommodation as something forced by unfortunate circumstances, or, it's even worse if you're sharing with your parents, the shame of moving back in. But why should that be so? The idea of voluntary shared accommodation may offer numerous advantages, both socially and ecologically. So in a world addicted to relocation, it offers the stability and support of the family structure when people have moved away from family. And there are clear ecological benefits from sharing food and living spaces. And unlike traditional monasticism, the new monasticism includes married couples with children. And so this may contribute to the question of population, where a community raises children without everyone necessarily having their own. And I know in my own life, not having children, those families that have been willing to share with me in really deep ways have been extremely life-giving to my own journey in that. Now, of course, both in any community and globally, we will inevitably run into the problems of sin. So Norman, I want to ask whether when people refuse this sort of transformation of self and continue to exploit place, what role does law have in constraining evil and promoting good? Should Christians see law as an aid or as a hindrance to the changes you've called for? And then what can theologians do? I think theologians in service to the church can offer this prophetic vision of life that reaches beyond consumption, that gives a wider view of life's success than Darwinian ideology can. We can offer a view of a fulfilled life that alters the boundaries of success and failure, that disregards social status, power, and prestige as the signs of a good life, and replaces them with love, justice, and service of others in the earth as central. But if we're going to do that, and theologians, I'm talking to us, then we need to get our own discipline in order. We can't on one side of our life live in a countercultural way that values placemaking and that mystical pull and practice of the deep connections that Philip talked about, while living in the other side of our life in the status-obsessed, success-driven, hyper-mobile, cutthroat competition culture of the academy. So my last question to both presenters is this: what work do we have to do in our own home, as it were, of the theological academy in how we define success and what we're sort of willing to think about as making it as a scholar? Thank you both very much.
Thank you, Bethany. We now have a few minutes for our speakers to respond. So I think following along with Bethany's response, we'll start with Philip and then go to Norman. So Philip, go for it.
Bethany, those are great questions. I also love the energy of this exchange, which feels dialogical and listening and willing to go in some directions that people haven't gone before. It's interesting. So you, to warm up, you mentioned the John Templeton Foundation and the unwillingness to do a lot of work in ecology. I'm currently on the board, and it was about a year ago when I said to the staff and board, so apparently the charter refuses or blocks any investment in ecology. And legal counsel spoke up almost without being able to stop and said, no, that's not true. And it's been a practice, but there's no reason in Sir John's charter that the foundation can't invest in forms of ecological study, which could include eco-theology. And since that time, there have actually been investments of the foundation, first investments in forms of study of the sciences of ecology and the ecological sides of theology. So I'm actually really encouraged. Some of the best books that the foundation has helped support have been through a program that Marianne Myers runs called Humble Approach Initiative. It's been running probably for 20 years now. And we're planning one on ecology and theology with some amazingly high-level scientists and theologians as well. So I'm actually encouraged in that one. And I would like to take that story as a way of thinking about ecology in the theological disciplines as well. This is actually not a great time for the public relations image of theology. I think it's fair to say. Even seminary students have an outspoken desire to avoid theology as much as possible. Now, one expected that at the more progressive or liberal seminaries in the past, but now to find more evangelically or traditionally oriented seminaries where students are trying to avoid that class in systematic theology, like, you know, Professor Tripp Fuller's not here this semester. There's an adjunct who supposedly offers an easy class. Maybe we can just take his class and then we can avoid having to really read those heavy tomes. This might be a time to think about theology in a new key. And that's where your comments, Bethany, a number of your comments take me. That might mean that we find a couple of the traditions in theology really in its entire history, but if I just think back over the last 60 years or so, that are openings for this mode of theology that I think each of us is advocating. So that's clearly true of liberationist traditions, where now, and I think that the oppressed of the poor as the oppressed of the earth, and the earth as itself oppressed, that's something that you touched on, Bethany, is a way to think the liberationist tradition, which I think is a biblical tradition, not an invention of some evil Marxists in Latin America, and to think about theology as having a prophetic voice to the most urgent issue that humans perhaps have faced in our history. When you hear scientists saying that we have something like 10 years to make major changes, or the effects, even if we change later, will continue for decades, even centuries beyond. When you hear that kind of language, you recognize that we're facing a kind of challenge that we haven't faced before. That brings me, Bethany, to your question about population growth. It's not enough to say, well, if we all just reduce our lifestyles a little bit, drive more hybrid cars, which we have to buy every 3 years, instead, that's not nearly going to be enough. And I will close with the story that John Cobb told in a series I did some years ago on faith in the future of the planet. I was still in the abstract end of the religion science discussion, and I remember him talking about the likely changes that were already being measured in the sciences. And I raised my hand in the discussion and said, so you think that tens of millions of people might die from these changes. He said already we have increased deaths, 1 million climate-related deaths in Africa last year. I mean, this is already here. And he said we are looking at hundreds of millions, if not billions, of deaths based on the collapse of ecosystems. It was at that point I realized that we needed a fundamental change, that we are in an era of Krisentheologie, of crisis theology, because we're on a planet in crisis. And that, I think, that mindset reorients all the other questions that we may come to. Thanks.
Thank you, Philip. Norman.
Sure. So first, thanks, Bethany. Lots of really good questions that you put on the table. I think one thing I would like to remind people is that theology has never been simply one thing, and it's not ever only been done in one modality. So we happen to be living in the shadows of the invention of theology as a university discipline, beginning with the University of Berlin, which really put in place a way of thinking about what the theological project is. That has produced some good things, but in a lot of ways, it's also been a disaster, because the kind of philosophical underpinning for it was, much of it was German idealist philosophy, which was not especially interested in the kinds of questions that we're thinking about today. You could argue about Hegel's philosophy of science, maybe, but the point is that what we're talking about is a theology that has made decisions to divorce itself from day-to-day kinds of living. And I think we need to just acknowledge that and realize that it's time for theologians to realize you can't continue doing this, because, I still encounter colleagues who are oblivious to what we might call climate crisis. It's just not something that is registering for them. So it's a serious deficiency. And I think another thing that I would say with that is that we have made this assumption that theology or philosophy, if we want to broaden it out some, are economic disciplines, which I think is simply false. It has always been false. So for instance, if you think about even science here, to say that it's been value-free is I don't see how you would sustain that when you think about the projects that we find in Descartes or in Bacon, that there clearly was an agenda to do something to the world that would be for human benefit. That's not a value-free conception of what science is. And I have many scientist friends who will say, I'm not promoting an agenda, but here you would have to ask questions about the coming together of science, applied science, technology, and then money, right? A friend of mine who is a conservation biologist said to me the other day that he thinks that the whole system of taxonomy is about to die because there is no funding for this kind of scientific research. Where's the funding going? Genetics. Where's the funding going? Technological applications, right? Which will have patents associated with it. So I think one of the things that we can do as theologians is we can reclaim the world for theological conversation, because in the 16th century, we gave it to scientists. We deal with the soul, you deal with the world. And that's been a disaster for theology, because it's cut theology off from science, it's cut theology from economics. And I think we need to bring these two back together again. So that's, I think, a very general observation that I would make about theology. Your question about carrying capacity is a fascinating one, because it's a very complex conversation that we can get into, and maybe some of our listeners will want to pursue this line of questioning, because there are so many levels on which we do this. It's not simply a quantity kind of measure around how many human beings are on the planet, but also how we're thinking about human systems, how we're thinking about energy systems, transportation. And your observation about the roles of community, or the new monastic communities that are imagining a different way for us to structure our lives together, I think is a really, really important one, because it helps us connect to something which is what a lot of theologians still imagine their work to be doing, I think, which is to do theology in service of a community of Christ followers. And so for theologians to have this understanding that the work they do is happening in a world, a social world, an ecological world, an economic, political world, where there is just so much violation, so much damage, right, gives theologians a fresh way, I think, to approach their traditions, their texts, their sacred texts, with the aim now of thinking, how can we reimagine life together and understand that the life together that we're talking about is not confined to human beings. The life together is always life with other creatures, plant, animal, human, along with the many myriad processes of decomposition, photosynthesis, respiration, and so forth that make any living together possible at all. And if we were to be able to expand the scope of what we believe both Christian faith, but also church or congregational mission and ministry are, it might help us learn to live in our places in ways that might actually be healing in some way. And I think that means we're going to be talking about scale. We're going to be talking about the importance of local economies, local kinds of infrastructure, distribution networks. All of these things will be on the table. And I think the benefit of this refocus will be that we'll start thinking about our food supply chains as a theological issue and not simply something that a few economists might worry about in their spare time.
Awesome. That was awesome. So we've gotten a bunch of questions that were sent in advance, and one that really connects right to where you finish is, how does Philip's organic Marxism and its call for localism connect with Norman's call to placemaking, where the criticisms are making similar and the calls they're giving to types of living in community connect? So maybe Philip could start to kind of, since he obviously didn't talk about the book. I know the person that sent it, and they're a organic Marxism fan.
Norm, that's one of the things I really liked about listening to your talk in advance and then hearing you summarize it tonight. The organic Marxism was a challenge to a traditional Marxist, which was very structuralist, state-owned industries, big picture statements about ideology and religion. And a postmodern Marxism would be one that was focused on individual communities living in a just way with each other and with the world. It's prompted by something that people are calling an eco-socialism. And that, for me, a Christian reading of it would be to think of the chapters 2 and 4 of the book of Acts, where after Pentecost, the individual community, the people on the way, live together and, quote, share all things in common. If you add an ecological dimension to that, then you have people living in a harmonious way with the planet. So creation theology together with that sort of post-Pentecost pattern, it seems to me that vision, I'm going to make it as a question to you, that vision vivifies your own work, at least in this talk, but also in some of your publications.
You know, I like that a lot, Philip. And one thing I'd respond to is, I've been reading some folks like Jason Moore or Andreas Malm, who are folks who are arguing that we're not in an Anthropocene world, but we're in a Capitalocene world, which is this idea that we live in the time of the commodification of everything. Okay, and this, of course, has been reflected in the way we treat land, the way we treat the whole world as a stockpile of natural resources. And so when I teach some courses in the School of the Environment at Duke, I ask the students, why do you think that we live in a world of natural resources? Because you've already commodified everything, right? And then the issue is, how do we manage our forests, or how do we manage freshwater systems to maximize their utility? And they say, well, what other way would there be to think about this? And this is where theologians, I think, have so much to give, not just Christian theologians, but religious traditions around the world, because they start with an assumption that the world is not a stockpile of commodities. The world is the place of gift. It's sacred gift. Now, if you start there, and I know there's a long conversation we could get into about gift economies and the anthropological literature around the gift that was inaugurated by Marcel Mauss, but gift is to think about the world in a fundamentally different way, because now, if it's especially understood to be a sacred gift, then every body, whether it's a plant body, animal body, human body, right, has an integrity about it which can be violated. And of course, this is something that the early scientific tradition had put in place, the sorts of technological development, the kinds of instrumental reasoning, quickly vanished, right, by the elimination of final causality.
So that leads me to ask, in return, would it be possible to do the kind of thing that used to be called systematic theology, thinking systemically from that starting point? So could you do a systematic theology of place? How many parts of the traditional loci, the kinds of questions that used to be raised, could be rethought in that way? So, for example, ecclesiology, community, picking up on Bethany's work with neo-monasticism, now thinking not just about person and place in this new framework that you offer us, but also the resources of understanding religious community, of understanding care for each other and the place that is constituted by the persons who are there. Your attack on the container notion.
Yeah.
Could one actually develop an entire way of thinking using, in this case, Christian resources?
Yeah, so I would have some hesitation about using the word systematic, partly because it's a mechanical metaphor. And secondly, because I think that if we're talking about a world as dynamic as I presuppose it to be, there isn't the possibility that we can tie things up very neatly into a bow. And systematicity seems to suggest something like that the parts all fit together in a way so that, it all makes sense. And I want to say that we're living in a world where that's a bit tricky to pull off. I don't know that anybody has the ability to, first of all, see enough to sort of characterize the whole system. So we're all operating from our own particular places, our own traditions, trying to make our way into an understanding of the many connections. I mean, I like the language that Pope Francis uses in Laudato Si, where he talks about integral ecology. Maybe this should be an integral theology as well, where we're talking about how these pieces join together, but they don't fit together in the way that machined pieces fit together. There's movement going on.
That's fair enough. I'm trying to tell whether how strongly we disagree here. So systematic has a negative connotation, yet for a prophetic critique, we need to offer a systemic critique. And words like capitalocene or Anthropocene offer a systemic perspective. Right. So isn't that just it's a change of word without a change of content? We want something that's integrated. We want something that involves systemic critique and systemic rebuilding. Yes. Can't that be a new, broader, more vibrant notion of what we used to call systematic?
It possibly, yes. You'd have to do a lot of work to do that. And I don't know that it'll work for everybody. So I say, you do your effort and see how it works. And I'll come alongside you.
Norman, I want to jump in here and just reiterate my question
please do.
about law, precisely because of the pluralism of the communities we live in and the global world we live in. Even if we develop the perfect systematic theology, and we invite everybody on this journey of transformation and harmonious living, there are going to be lots of people who will just say, I'll have no part in it. So what do we do then, especially given personal transformation is slow and the change we need is fast? How do we address that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, it sort of comes to your question about should we have law and how might theologians come alongside to help us think this through. So on the one hand, I think it's absolutely crucial that we understand the work that we're doing is not simply about personal virtue, right? We have to get out of the mindset that the main task of theology is something like the cultivation of individual souls to get you prepared for heaven. And we need to understand theology, if we do, as an economic enterprise, which means that we have to talk about public policy. And this is so important to do. And I feel really fortunate to be at a place like Duke, where I have colleagues in the different schools, School of Environment, School of Law, Public Policy. And I can come into a conversation with them and use theological grammars or logics, if you want to put it that way, to help them reframe the issues that they're struggling with. So for instance, in public policy schools, you would think that there's a pretty robust conversation about the common good, or that in a law school, you'd have robust conversation about justice. And what you discover when you're actually with the professors and the students, it doesn't happen. It's not happening. And part of it is that there's just an inarticulacy around the ability of people to talk about ends, to talk about meaning, value, and purpose. And this is something that I think theologians can talk about, should talk about, but they need to be in conversation with public policy people, with legal scholars, so that we can understand what difference would it make if we took an idea that a human life is sacred, or that a landscape is sacred, and therefore we need to think about, well, what are the legal protections? What are the legal mechanisms that we might use to do something like actual protection, right? That's something a theologian sitting in an office reading Schleiermacher or Barth or whomever your theologian is not going to get a lot of traction with. And so what I'm actually saying is it's time for theologians to get out of their offices, get with other scholars in other disciplines, and actually move into neighborhoods, move into habitats, understand watersheds, right? Start to understand how the living that we do as people is thoroughly entangled with the living we do with other people, other creatures, and places.
So a follow-up question that we have from somebody in the audience, I think actually dovetails really nicely with this one, is about the science of belief change more broadly. And you could also expand that to be like the science of life habit, life pattern change. And this is something I've been playing around with for a couple of years now, I think. It's sort of like, how do we change, like how does one go about the business of creating pathways for people to experience significant changes cognitively, emotionally, spiritually, because certainly I think we can probably say that personal transformation connects to societal transformation. So it's almost like the flip side of the law question, right? So is this a top-down thing? Is this a bottom-up thing? And I know there's huge debate about this in eco-theology. But I'm wondering if the three of you have any insights or ideas, or sort of like, if you had $3 billion to do whatever you wanted to do, how would you go about creating the sort of personal and social change? How would you go about creating new experiences for people, cognitive pathways, experiential pathways, societal, communal, local sort of avenues for people to get plugged in to their systems in a way that they become personally invested in rectifying and transforming the ecological crisis?
Well, Sarah, since you're one of the acknowledged leaders in this kind of behavioral change, why don't you take a minute or two and talk about something about the science? And then I think the three of us could talk about it in the ecological realm. But what is the science of behavior change, just life pattern change? Could you give us a little bit of the background?
So my own kind of interest in this has come through big questions essentially about how personal religious beliefs change, how people move from a place of non-belief to belief in God or gods, right? And so, I mean, people tend to divide quite quickly into two camps around this sort of discussion. And so one avenue is one that's very prevalent within cognitive science of religion. It's sort of the idea that religious belief is quite normal. It's almost mundane, and that people form beliefs very, very naturally. It's just a kind of an inbuilt mechanism that we have because of our evolutionary history, and that no great sort of exceptional experience or religious experience is required in order for one to feel a felt sense of belief in a God and a relationship with that God. Another stream of research focuses more on exceptional experiences. So focuses more on those moments, those small moments in time duration that have an outsized effect on our long-term cognition. So sort of those experiences that might not be dramatic to everyone on the outside, but are personally dramatic, personally transformative, pivotal in one way or another. And most people have experiences like that in their own personal histories, even if it's not related to God. So people have kind of watershed moments, tiny moments that changed everything. And so so there's a sort of a dual processing, and I'm not using this in the technical sense of the term. There's a sort of dual pathway towards personal change when it comes to religious belief. And I wonder if there might be something like that that could be brought into this conversation about ecological beliefs and beliefs about a change in one's orientation to their environments. I mean, my personal sense is that there are at least two things that need to happen. One being, so there's like a knowledge base, there's a factual base, there's a theological doorway that needs to be open for people so that they see that this is like, that they recognize on an intellectual, cognitive level that this is an important conversation worth having. I think there's also an experiential level, and that's the one I think is probably more playful there's probably much more room to play in this area. Like, how do we create experiences for people that are going to be immersive and transformative enough that they are then motivated to go about doing the hard theological work, the intellectual work, the social work required to affect the sorts of changes that we currently need. So I'll stop there. So go for it, the rest of you.
It's a question that's right at the heart of the work of all three of us. I'll set a timer for 2 minutes for myself and see if we can each get 2 minutes to address it. Karen Lipkin has a book on eco-villages around the world. And as she traveled the world writing this book, she found that those eco-villages that had a set of shared beliefs lasted longer, were more successful. She found in Sri Lanka, for example, 7,000 villages, eco-villages, where shared Buddhist beliefs led to the endurance of the community over time. I believe mostly in immersive living in a context where people share the work and the farming and the cooking, and find that those experiences, even in the period of a single summer, can be transformative. But I do in classes in seminary and together with the Claremont colleges called Seizing an Alternative Toward an Ecological Civilization. We have the students get out of the classroom every 2 or 3 weeks to work in an ecological community, a farm, experimental facility, each time getting their hands in the dirt and then eating food that's raised on that property. So in the course of a 15-week semester, one can already, and the students will say how much that changes their thinking and their desire for what they do after the class is over. I'll stop there.
So yeah, really, really good stuff here. I would just put one word on the table: kinesthesia. The idea that our knowing happens through our bodies. And this is so important, which of course the university ways of thinking about theology and philosophy and whatever else, that's just been completely shorn off the frame. And I think what we need to do is figure out how to find ways to get people back into places. One of the things that we don't appreciate enough is how we as human beings today, in developed countries in particular, are living a lifestyle that nobody on the history of the planet could have imagined, which is we buy everything we need. And right now it's delivered to our door, even put in our fridges, and soon enough we'll pay someone to put it in our mouths. We don't have to do anything to survive. And it's the lack of that kind of embodied engagement with other living things, other processes, that has made us some of the most ignorant, and I would also say sympathy-less or unsympathetic dwellers on this planet. And so anything we can do to involve people's bodies in things like food production, home construction, even things like cooking and playing musical instruments, where you have to develop a kind of muscle knowledge so that you can sense things at a much more visceral level, would be a wonderful way to get started. And I'll stop there. And Bethany, bring us on home.
Well, I mean, I think two things are really important about changing hearts and minds. And the first is that just more information is not going to do it. Anyone with an ounce of curiosity has more information at the tips of their fingers than they could possibly imagine. And that's clearly not the solution, which pains my heart as a teacher, because I feel like if people just knew, and that's actually not the problem. And the second, and this relates to yours, Norman, is that people who feel like they're under threat don't change their minds. And so because when I get into that defensive place, because a new idea is threatening, I can't change. So I think that there needs to be a gentle approach, but an approach that works with cultures, that works with changing the boundaries of what's acceptable to believe and what's unacceptable, and carefully working with those. So I was just thinking, let's get a worship song, a hit worship song that people will sing regularly, that people will, and if there's anybody here watching tonight and or you are a huge worship leader, get in touch with me. We'll work on an ecological song together and we'll put it out there. And that starts to change how people think in that heartfelt way, where making something that's maybe a cultural battle becomes acceptable, becomes, this is actually the norm, this is what we believe, this is how we go about it.
Can I just add one quick thing yet? I think one example that is instructive is when new urbanists were trying to get people to switch the way they thought about built environments. They did this thing called the charrette, which is you don't just talk to people about how you design neighborhoods, how you put sidewalks and boulevards and mixed use and all that sort of stuff in your design plan. You actually show them. You get them out walking so they see the difference between a place that has no communal spaces, has no public benches, and then see the difference with a place that does. And so, insofar as we can create what we might call exhibition projects or something of that sort, where people can see the difference between one way of structuring economies versus another way, I think that's a huge thing.
One of the things that strikes me about mind change, like each religious tradition, I think has different ways they imagine the nature of the collective and the community. And something you both highlight is the kind of like when the world becomes commodity and the individual becomes a consumer, you've already created an anthropology and a doctrine of creation that's like anti-Bible and basic Christianity, right? And it's unquestioned. And if I was thinking of a beginning place in a congregational setting, then I think I would look at Philippians, because in the book of Philippians, Paul uses the koinonia, but participation in a number of ways. So you let the same mind be in you that's in Christ Jesus. You share in the suffering of Christ. You share in the giving of the community. You bear one's sins together. There are so many ways in which the identity of the Christian is a shared collective one. And it's one in which to have that identity means you've already obligated yourself to care for the other in their worst times and their best times, to share in joy and suffering and pain. And if we can start to do that as collectives, that's what we come to share in worship, is to be a body that decides to live life together, sharing these things. Then we start to resist the ideology or the liturgies of commodification and individualism that then support the consumer logic that is polluting the planet and pillaging the poor. And as long as most of our daily liturgies are on this economistic religion that we don't want to call a religion because it's just how the world is, right? Like with the way Norman talked about natural resources, we've internalized the doxologies of consumerism to the point that just like basic New Testament Christianity, the idea that the collective would want to participate in a mind where you give of yourself for the well-being of the whole, such that the collective comes to participate in the life-giving way of the one who gave himself for all, so that all are come into the divine life. That doesn't make any sense to you, right? So anyway,
Preach it, man. Preach it.
Well, look, I've been locked down. I moved to a new country, and I'm Baptist, and even sermons I do here are only half the length I'm used to. So it can get sidetracked. So with that, there is this fascinating question. How do different religious traditions describe nature? And how does the arrival of scientific rationality impact it? Or maybe the economic system that comes with the encounter with the West, how does it impact it? You each brought it up in different ways, and I know Bethany's doing some real fascinating work in restoration ecology currently. But so maybe you can unpack the way our different religious traditions see nature, and then the way the scientific arrival of science impacts that definition.
Let me try just the first part of the question and then hand off to Norman Bethany for what comes afterwards. See if I can do 6 religions in 12 sentences. So we starting with Christianity, which I won't re-explain. Islam is, if anything, more theocentric than even Christianity. In Al-Ghazali, every cause is God directly acting, so that it's not even clear that the human or the animal acts at all, has a sort of concurrence, perhaps, with something that God has done. Judaism, by contrast, tends to ascribe to the world more of its own integrity. God created the universe itself out of the letters of Torah, says one tradition. And the integrity of those eternal words of the Almighty underlies everything else. So that a miracle by God in one rabbinical discourse, where God shifts the walls of the building, the rabbis rightly dismiss because God's word was given, the Torah was given in the creation of the universe, and a miracle later can't overcome those. Let's move to the East. Taoism is an incredible religion of a sort of mystic unity, recognizing that all of nature is one single whole with its own integrity. It has different complementary forces, yin and yang, that pull against each other, sometimes understood as masculine, feminine, sun and moon, and light and dark. But on the other hand, those are just two impulses within an underlying unity. The one gives rise to the two, gives rise to the three, gives rise to the 10,000, or the multitude of things. Confucianism is actually a beautifully environmental religion because it's based on the idea of a single triangle of Tian, or heaven, at the top. Humanity has a special place, but nature is an equal side of that triangle. So only when there's a harmony of these sort of ultimate values of the patterns of nature and of how we live do we live well? Can we live the life of quality? Buddhism is, for, I think, the environmental movement, maybe the religion par excellence to decentralize from humanity. For Buddhism, everything arises out of everything else. Pratitya samutpada means when one thing is given, the others arise. The network of causes and conditions is the reality, and we're just nodes within it. Spirituality is a statement about that entire realm of all sentient beings. And then we come full circle with Hindu Vedanta, because the same network of appearances that we see there in Vedanta, it's Maya, is all located within one overarching divine, Brahman, within which everything else exists. Brahman is Sat Chit Ananda, being, consciousness, and bliss. And we participate in that, recognizing ourselves as something like divine sparks, ways in which the divine is present, modes of the divine presence itself. A beautiful range for understanding what nature is across those 6 traditions.
Thank you so much, Philip. I think in terms of the effect that science has had on Christian belief and sort of what we might think of as Western beliefs is really, really complex. But I mean, one of the important things that it did was that it desacralized the world. In order to do science, you can't have a world that is inhabited by gods and spirits and other things, but you also need a world that's ordered. And in some ways, Christianity contributed to that expectation of an ordered world. But at the same time, it has killed the sort of mysticism that comes about. And so, I see a great waterfall with rainbows shining off it, and I think, oh, gravity and refraction of light through water particles, I can explain that. And it loses its wonder. And that's not a necessary implication of science, but it often is the way that people, especially people who are not scientists, understand the effect of science on their life. If I can explain it, if I have some knowledge of what's going on, then it's shorn of any spiritual meaning. Norman.
Yeah, those are all really good. And I'll just add one other dimension, and that is the economic one, which is, I think, so important. We have beautiful traditions that in their sacred texts describe the kind of harmonious life together that we all would love to see happen. But of course, in almost every culture that espouses these wonderful sacred texts, we see economic degradation happening on massive scales. So Ye Fu Tuan, the great geographer of the last century, goes back to China and discovers that, there is this beautiful Taoist and Confucian set of traditions, and yet the Chinese have destroyed their places like everybody else. And so what I would caution against is that we judge judge our own tradition by our histories and other traditions by their sacred texts. let's understand that every religious tradition has a lot of work to do to explore their own traditions, to see how they can sort of raise up a kind of bulwark against the commodification of the world that has happened in the last several centuries. That is the powerful force that is shaping absolutely everything on this planet, including the best in our religions. And so religious people have a really important role to play from across the planet to see, how do you say no to neoliberalism?
Amen to that, Norm.
So there were a couple questions around this, and I'll try to ask it so it flows in the conversation. But there was a question around the separation of fact and value and the way that exists in our contemporary society. And we've all internalized this kind of division, be it in the academy, in the privatization of religion, these type of things, and some of the kind of foundational mythology of neoliberalism and the market and market ideology. In one of the questions that came out in response to an observation that I think Cobb and Keller made in one of the previous sessions was the role of the scientific lens. And Norman mentioned this about like Bacon and Descartes and these type of things. Like, they weren't value free. They had an agenda in what they were doing. Like, whether or not there's a way to both preserve the knowledge we gain through the sciences without absolutizing some of these unexamined metaphysical or philosophical commitments that are in it, that have commodified and maybe flattened reality in the world. And one of the people said, I totally like that idea. I'm not exactly sure what it meant, so I'd love them to talk about it again.
Let me just start. It's complex enough that it'll take several of us, probably including you and Sarah as well, to straighten it out. Modernity was not just the time when the idea of fact was discovered, but it was a certain metaphysic built around a certain construal of fact. So to take a more integrated worldview in most of the indigenous traditions, there were clearly facts about the world that were recognized, but the facts were wrapped into a different kind of story of place, of who we are, of where we live, of ultimate values built into this world around us. But in the battle against the attempt of Western Christianity in particular to control all values and all knowledge, the early scientists of the, say, 15th, 16th, 17th centuries had to push back and to say, no, we need a space free from Mother Church. This is going to be a space, and it's the only space they could decide on, which is value free. So our facts are value free. Since the church owned the metaphysic, then they were left with something as superficial, is as vacuous as the notion of matter itself. So Thomas Hobbes said in 1649, all that exists is matter in motion. I'll just jump right to the thesis and then stop. In this century, it's time for us to say that that particular metaphysic is not necessary for the doing of science. Not the materialism or physicalism in the sense that physics is the ultimate guide to all ontology, and not the value-free nature of some human endeavor, like science, as if no values pertain to it. A science which still is replicable, empirically based, fights dogmatism, holds a critical mindset. All of those core qualities of science can still be pursued without having to adopt that modernist worldview. Tripp, you've often on your broadcasts made clear that process philosophy, Whitehead, is a helpful way to push back against that worldview, but there are many others as well. We can be scientists and accept a sacred place ontology in the way that indigenous peoples did.
When you say that, Phil, it reminds me of the Whitehead quote when he said, the enormous success of scientific abstractions has foisted onto philosophy the task of accepting them as the most concrete rendering of fact. How depressing. And I just found this. I've been reading a lot of Arthur Eddington, and he has this line where he said that physics has in the main contented itself with studying the abridged edition of the Book of Nature.
Sweet.
And I think that it's important to say that, right? Because a lot of the time responses I get from people that are atheists, and they're like, "You were really into science, Trip, and you like these things. I just don't even know why you keep God around." I think the religious response is, no, we're actually trying to preserve space for you to acknowledge all the depth dimension of human existence, and not just chuck secondary qualities off as phantoms of the phantoms of your qualia or whatnot. So do you think that I'm interested in how the others of you address or frame that predicament?
So yeah, this is brilliant. I'm loving this. One way I might come to this is that there's this new thing coming around now called Hermeneutics of Nature, right? And it builds on Gadamer and Schleiermacher and some other folks. And it's really, really helpful because it starts with the assumption that there is no uninterpreted fact, okay? And if you start with that assumption, then you realize that any way of seeing, any theoria, is always bound up with an ethos and ascesis, right? A way of being in the world. Pierre Hadot made this way of speaking really important and powerful in earlier traditions, but it carries on in today. And so just one example of how this might play out is, Darwin and neo-Darwinism now are sort of the ruling scientific paradigm in which every discipline seems to have to be able to give Darwin as an explanation for every fact. It's kind of silly, actually, but it's still very powerful. And my point is not to say that Darwin didn't make important scientific discoveries. Absolutely, he did. So what I'm interested in is the philosophical framework in which so much neo-Darwinian discourse happens. It assumes a whole metaphysics. And in Darwin's own autobiography, he talks about how he had been looking at the world of facts for a great length of time and had no interpretive lens by which to make sense of it. And so how did that happen for him? He said he read the gloomy parson Thomas Malthus. And Malthus was the one who gave him that hermeneutical lens. And what is that hermeneutical lens? Survival of the fittest, right? If you're not fit, you die. That's it. And he said, this was the interpretive key that made sense of the whole world, right? It's Tennyson's nature read in tooth and claw. Now, here's a question. Darwin looks out at the world. He sees a world of competition, struggle, and death. It's about survival. That's it. And it's tough out there. Now, why is it that indigenous traditions, many of them, looking at the world, looking at it with as much detail as Darwin did, and Darwin had very detailed descriptions of the things he observed, why is that indigenous traditions, when they look out at the world, they don't see nature read in tooth and claw? They see kinship. They see communities. So the question is, what's going on? Are they inhabiting different worlds? Well, no, they're operating out of different interpretive frameworks. And so anything that we can do to come alongside scientists and scientists come alongside us to say, let's talk about the interpretive frameworks by which we're making sense of anything, that would be really generative.
Yeah, I think that sort of reminds me of a quote by Bertolt Brecht, where he talks about the motto of hell is eat or be eaten, but the motto of heaven is eat and be eaten. And I just like that. It's this sense of we can see nature as everything trying to compete, everything trying to rip the sustenance of life from other creatures, or we can see it as everything supporting everything else. And that's something Charles Kingsley was saying, in the 1880s in response to Darwinian evolution. And just going back to the 19th century, that's also when we see the real shift. Although the disenchantment of the world had taken hold before that, that's really the time, 1860 to 1900, where you see the transformation of the culture of scientists becoming adamantly naturalist, not only in their methodology, but in their ontology. And that was a concerted effort by people like Thomas Henry Huxley and the X Club in London, who just, they took it upon themselves to mark national exams, and they would just mark down anybody who brought any sort of theistic consideration in, while marking up those who had naturalistic things. They had all these ways of changing culture and they succeeded very well in that. And so again, I think at some point we need to ask, how do we actually make a difference on the ground? How do we change culture? And I don't know, but I think that's where we need to head.
I wonder if some listeners are saying you're making things too easy for yourselves because science does require a physicalism, and none of the three of you are advocating that. And I'm looking in particular at Sarah Lane Ritchie, who has challenged whether we really can or should move beyond a basically physicalist understanding of the world. Or maybe that's not your position, I've misunderstood it. But I can imagine a skeptic wanting to hear that voice.
I've been having many debates lately about whether or not I'm actually a physicalist or whether I'm playing fast and loose with words, which probably is actually what's happening here. I'm certainly not a reductive physicalist, but I'm not as averse to the physicalist label as I think probably most are in theology and science and religion, for sure. I'm certainly a naturalist and quite happy to sort of make a theistic case for that. My main concern is that we are not. My main concern is that we don't become fearful or stay fearful, as the case may be, of physicality. I think we seem to be constantly trying so hard to distance ourselves from all things physical, and I really resist that. And I also don't. I'm not too bothered by physical explanations. So even physicalist explanations for things, I think somebody I would recommend actually. So Tripp and I, a mutual friend of Tripp's and I here in the UK is Fiona Ellis, and she's written a wonderful book called God, Value, and Nature. And she and I have had some great discussions about the role of value in nature. And I think she would have an expansive. I don't want to. She wouldn't call herself a physicalist, I don't believe, but she and I could go a long way together. In finding ways that the physicalists and certainly the naturalists would be able to affirm like objective value in nature. And she would argue for the inclusion of value as within nature itself as not only permissible, but explanatorily necessary. And so any sort of physicalism, I think, that I would want to entertain is one that would recognize the necessity of value, of experience, of a lot of other things that a lot of physicalists might not be on board for, but I think they could be. So, sorry.
I was just going to say, I've been working on Sarah branding her position, and about the new materialist. I think Sarah's position is the new materialist. Like
PNUMA.
Yeah. And I don't know if anyone wants to print her up a t-shirt, but I really feel like we're like 2 years from an AAR session on the new materialist. And
we're probably 2 years from any AAR session at all anyway. But I actually found that this detour and Sarah's comments really helpful. I wonder whether Bethany and Norm would also be willing to say, as I would, that to look for a sort of new naturalism. And as Sarah said, I'd be willing to make a theistic defense of it. For all of us, there's a focus in on natural communities and connection with a piece of land, a place, a community of people who are farming and cooking, eating and making art together. And physicality, that the physicalness of our existence seems to be something that none of us shy away from. In the way that Sarah just said. Physicalism is a word she didn't defend, and I think maybe that one might have to go. But a reorientation back toward the earth using words like that strikes me as crucial, and maybe we need to name that as possible and allowable and even encouraged for people who are theists.
I absolutely agree with that. And I think, one of the things I tell students is I want you to understand creation, not as a teaching about the origin of the world, however long ago. I want you to think about creation as God's love made variously visible, fragrant, tactile, auditory, and delicious, which means that materiality is where it is at. It's not just that God makes material creation the object of God's love. It is the actual medium of God's love. So I love this new materialism. That's great. I love that. I'll buy a t-shirt. Right. So that means we have to think about a wholesome materialism, which is not reductive, right? So reductive materialism is something that I would be very concerned about. But affirmation of materiality, I think, is at the heart of a doctrine of creation. And of course, within Christian traditions, this is expressed most, poignantly, I would say, in the incarnation, because it's the fullness of God coming to dwell in the body of Jesus.
Yeah. And I think particularly in our culture, starting with the body as gift is so important. I mean, speaking as a woman, that is a difficult thing to do in our culture. And yet, how can I love the materiality of the earth if I'm ready to crawl out of my own skin? It's like RuPaul says, if you can't love yourself, how the hell are you going to love somebody else? And I think that there's how will you love the earth if you don't love your own body? And so, I mean, so many of these things are the alienation from the world is symptomatic of an internal alienation.
Well, and the materiality of the world is also a source of a lot of pain for us, right? You can eat stuff that will kill you. You can be out working, something will fall on your head and kill you. I mean, the world is a dangerous place. It's not all peaches and cream.
Thank you. It actually segues really nicely into what I think will have to be our final question. We have about 10 minutes left here. So I think it'd be great to end with a question that maybe gets at your current growth edges. And namely, that has to do with what part of your own religious tradition, or if you wouldn't want to use that language, what your religious framework, spiritual background, whatever, so where you currently inhabit, what space you currently inhabit on the spiritual landscape. What core belief or what kind of core tenet of your own religious framework do you currently find the most problematic and the most troubling in this particular moment in history? And I'll include not only scientific knowledge in that, but also the current crises that we exist in. So what's the thing that you're wrestling with, a part of your own spiritual experience, your own religious framework that you're uncomfortable with, that you're not quite perhaps ready to publish about, but are something that you're wanting to push back on or tweak, or that you foresee needing to change in some way?
Well, I'm sort of a Bapta, Penta, Anglicostal something. So my religious tradition is varied and difficult, and I mean, at the moment, I'm in an Anglican church and sort of committed to that framework. And this lockdown has been agonizing because everything's about taking communion, especially in the high Anglican church I attend, and suddenly we can't. And so I've been having this crazy discussion with myself, with one half of me saying, it doesn't matter if you're a priest. The Pentecostals, like, you don't have to be a priest. Don't worry about that. Just go for communion. But you can't be alone. It's only where 2 or 3 are gathered. And if you do live alone, then you're outside that. Meanwhile, the Anglican is like, it's fine to do it alone, but you've got to be a priest. And, and so I think how do we remain the church? How do we have sacramentality when it may be years that we're dealing with this COVID crisis?
I have a lot of points of contention with the tradition that I am in. And I think the one that I would focus on in particular is the way so many Christians understand salvation. And salvation means fundamentally an escape from their bodies and an escape from this world. And I find that an utter catastrophe, theologically speaking, because the grammar of theology, of course, is the reverse, that from the very beginning, God has wanted to be with creatures. It starts in a garden with God as the gardener, taking care of all the life. And it ends in Revelation with God declaring that the home of God is among mortals, and there's no escape to some other heaven, but the heavenly city descending to earth. And so I think at root is this fundamental, fear that God absolutely loves everything. And so the desire to narrow that love to the rather puny register of, people who look like me has been a disaster. And so what I would love to see is for a way that the way we think about salvation might be expanded to include God's love for every creature, every body, every place.
The issue I would name is the separate God and divine action. The separateness of God from creation, even if God is everywhere, like Psalm 139, but still that continuing separateness and divine action. I yearn for a way to understand God embracing the world. Incarnation should do that in the Christian tradition, but substance metaphysics ended up preserving a kind of de facto dualism in a teaching that should have blown the dualism out of the water. I find talk of panpsychism in recent philosophy and theology, including in the University of Edinburgh work, helpful. I think that it's a place where Christians whose tradition has fallen short of its source documents and its own spirituality through the centuries need to take some pilgrimages. We need some Sherpas from other religions to listen and learn and come back to our own documents, having shed the assumptions of a substance dualism, many of the mistakes of the West, and I think Norm's right, of some of the economic assumptions of Western thought, some of the scientific assumptions of Western thought, and to come back to our own documents differently. What I think we get are two things. We get a sense of God and world that interpenetrate. God is not just present to persons and bits of matter, but it is as true to say that we are completely immersed within the divine as that the divine is completely immersed within us. And that deconstructs a dualism of spirit and body, perhaps in the directions that Sarah was pulling us toward, in a sort of integrated physicality, so that to say that something is spirit-filled or spiritual doesn't mean that it's not fully physical in the most robust possible sense of that word. And ultimately, I think, and maybe this is the common theme that came out today, we learned from the first spiritual traditions on this planet of indigenous peoples, where the spirituality was unapologetically located within this mountain, this river, this rock, and above all else, and this is Norm's major point, I think, this place, not as a container, but as a spirit-filled, infused, co-constituent of reality with the persons who are blessed to live in that place. If we could go in those kind of directions, I think we would have offered a corrective to centuries of mistaken Christian thought in ways that I think our planet desperately needs.
Thank you. Thank you. So as we wrap up, after Sarah answers this question, because I know she really wanted to, I can tell from her face. No, you're going to. You're already on the screen, like you're already obligated, because I want to hear your answer. And Bethany already approves of it. I want to make sure all three of you get an opportunity to let anyone know where they can find like the work and stuff you're doing, or books connected to stuff that came up, or like Phil could talk about, let everyone know about the Project for Ecological Civilization. The thing that popped in my mind about the question was, one, when the more I spent time thinking about panpsychism, the easier it is to read the Psalms. And I mean, I think that's obvious why, but it's wonderfully fascinating to have wisdom literature hold you deeply in ways it didn't before. The element that's hardest for me currently is praying for my enemies. And I was good at it. Like, I mean, I don't know what good at being it, but like when I was a minister, I wrote prayers for Osama bin Laden and had everyone pray it every week, right? Like praying for your enemies. I did. Not that like, I just think it changes you. And now there are people I love and will go to their funerals who are just completely blinded to the right-wing death cult and white supremacy that's running my home, and are resisting transformations that plenty of us have been praying for once we realized what we were complicit in, and that our neighbors of color have been hoping we would see, and now they're resisting. And it's just like, I'm just glad we're just supposed to pray for them. And so like my biggest challenge is that again, and I don't know what to do. Like with the question y'all had about like how you change minds, like I don't know what to do. I've just looked at friends and family recently and just thought, how could you have been someone God loved me through and this? So, and this isn't a partisan thing at all. Like, it's not about like, I can enjoy conservative political philosophy and discuss it and things. It's specifically that you refuse to listen to the overwhelming testimony of people's experience under systems that you whitewash with the emphasis on the white.
Thank you, Trip. Yeah, similarly, yeah, I mean, I think the thing I'm struggling with, okay, I'll try and make this, it's a bit of a downer at first, but I'll try and make it a little bit more positive and redemptive at the end. I think the thing that I struggle with the most at the moment with the Christian tradition, and in particular, actually, the kind of the newer directions I've been going with Christianity in the last few years, which is definitely in a direction where the relationship between God and creation is one of utmost intimacy, where there is no deism, there's no quasi-deism, that God and nature are at the very least, as intimately connected as possible. But still being distinct from each other in some way or another. And that intimacy actually makes, I think, the problem of divine hiddenness actually much, much worse. So, and in particular, I'm meaning people who struggle to experience and know God in a way that they would like. And I think I would also even put like despair in here. People like the kind of the existential questions that people really, really suffer from. If we have a God of classical theism that's kind of removed from us in a way and is sort of like out there somewhere, it's much easier, I think, to kind of deal with those human questions. I think the closer our sort of like our theological kind of like metaphysics brings God and creation, the more intimate that God and creation are, the more integrated physicality that we embrace and connect God to that, the more difficult it becomes to explain why God feels so absent to so many people. And I think that's particularly salient right now. I think a lot of people are finding themselves in despair of one form or another and seeking a God that they're not finding. And that could be due to the experience of mortality, their awareness of their own mortality that they're facing in the face of COVID-19. It could be because of the lockdown conditions in which they are essentially isolated from everything that means anything to them. And of course, the larger social issues surrounding systemic racism and trying to, struggling through meaning-making processes in the middle of all of that. So I think that there are some problems, some of the classic problems about God become more problematic. The more hopeful our theology gets. So that's probably the thing I struggle with the most theologically. But I do actually still feel quite a lot of I feel a spark of hope around the possibility of what, I mean, you guys have all probably heard me talk about spiritual technologies, right? So I don't think that we have to be passive recipients of our past experience continuing into the future, right? So to the extent that we are co-creators or agents or creative beings who can create new pathways and possibilities in the world, I think that we are well placed to probably better than anybody else in history, well placed to create new, immersive experiences for ourselves and others that affect our phenomenology, affect our experience of God in the world. So that's it for me. Trip, would you like to?
I just want to let anyone share any place they want to send people.
Plug your stuff. Yeah.
You can find me at the Divinity School faculty webpage. It's not too hard to discover. I'm the last person on the list.
The advantage of the W. So my website is philipclayton.net. And but most important, and where I put actually most of my time these days, is with the Institute for Ecological Civilization, ecociv.org. We've just published a book, What is Ecological Civilization, which is Crisis, Hope, and the Future of the Planet, together with Andrew Schwartz. And we're engaged in work around the world now to have these kinds of discussions, and then to have them with policy leaders who can actually make a difference in areas of economics, of water, food justice, and so forth. So ecociv.org would be where you'd find my heart.
For me, I'm the only Bethany Sollereder in the world. So if you can manage to spell my last name, you can find everything I've done quite easily. And don't buy my book; it's too expensive. It's crazy. But do some of the work that I'm proudest of has been things like For the Christian Century and Biologos and other sort of popular versions. So that's what I would say.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for joining us. The University of Edinburgh thanks you, who sponsored this project with our quick action grant. Yeah, well done, Scotland. And this coming Thursday, same start time as this one, we're going to be talking about philosophical theology, except they're both high church Anglicans doing philosophical theology. So if Bethany's conversation around the Eucharist lures you into thinking through the philosophical notions of participation and community, and then how you use the distance of a community while simultaneously affirming its unity as a space to think through relationships in a time of crisis and what the nature of hope is, then you're going to have some fun. Andrew Davison from Cambridge is going to be one of the contributors, who's part of our big grant we're all working on right now with God in the Book of Nature. And Scott McDougall, who is at the Episcopal School over in Berkeley, California, who has written my favorite ecclesiology that's come out in the last 20 years. It is an eschatological ecclesiology of futurity participation. Yeah, if you Google that, then you should definitely show up, because that's such a nerdy lure that you are meant to be there on Thursday for some fun. So with that, good night. Thank you all for hanging out, and we will see you all soon.
Thanks so much.
Bye, Trip. Thanks, Trip and Sarah.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.